In this section, we'll look at Franklin Roosevelt, the man. As his name implies, Franklin Roosevelt was born to the wealthy New York family, the Roosevelts, centered in their estate off the Hudson River at Hyde Park, New York. Franklin Roosevelt was Teddy Roosevelt's fifth cousin. He did, however, marry Eleanor Roosevelt, another distant cousin of his, who was Teddy Roosevelt's direct niece. FDR knew Teddy Roosevelt was still popular and used it to his political advantage, as well as obviously the money and connections that his family name brought. Born in 1882, Franklin Roosevelt attended the elite Groton School and Harvard University. With his political advantages obvious, FDR entered the New York State Senate at the age of only 28, after dropping out of Columbia Law School, but he did, I should note, pass the New York bar exam anyway, and he briefly worked as a Wall Street lawyer. In the Senate, New York Senate, FDR was a reformist Democrat, opposing the old New York political machine known as Tammany Hall. In 1912, Franklin Roosevelt supported Woodrow Wilson for president, breaking again from Tammany Hall, and winning for him after Wilson's election the appointment of Assistant Secretary of Navy. Wilson undoubtedly selected the young Roosevelt because the position had once been Teddy Roosevelt's, and Wilson also wanted to sort of tie himself into the former president's popularity. In 1920, at only the age of 38, the Democrats nominated the young Roosevelt as their vice presidential nominee under Ohio's James Cox. Once again, the Roosevelt's name undoubtedly played a role in his selection. The Republicans, however, won the race, and Roosevelt returned to private practice of law in New York. In August 1921, while the Roosevelts were vacationing at Campobello Island in New Brunswick, Canada, Roosevelt fell ill and was diagnosed with polio, one of the most feared diseases of its day. Polio made many victims quadriplegic, mandating a life in an iron lung just to live. Roosevelt, however, was a paraplegic. He'd lost use of both his legs and had to live the rest of his life in a wheelchair. For the rest of his life, Roosevelt refused to believe doctors who told him he'd never recover, and he often exercised and did physical therapy in water, never saying surrender. In 1926, he bought a resort in Warm Springs, Georgia, where he founded a hydrotherapy center for the treatment of polio victims. In 1938, FDR helped found what eventually became known as the March of Dimes, a charity for children suffering from paralysis. FDR also refused to believe that his political career was over, which was an amazing assumption given that most people who were disabled at the time were regarded as, quote, crippled, and thus somehow not whole, somehow not able to, or competent completely. FDR tried to hide his paralysis using iron leg braces under his pants, and often with the assistance of family members or aides, to give the illusion that he could still stand. Cameramen and journalists, by the way, didn't frequently take pictures of him in his wheelchair out of deference to his position. The cure for polio, by the way, was invented by Jonas Salk in the early 1950s, and it is less of a threat today. In 1929, FDR was elected New York's governor, again a position that Teddy Roosevelt had had, facing off with his fellow New Yorker Al Smith, who would also run for the presidential nomination in 1932. Roosevelt cast himself as a social reformer, an activist, an anti-corruption governor. By 1932, he was indeed very popular. Throughout it all, FDR was an early master of the new medium, radio, which had exploded in the 1920s. FDR wanted to use the medium to speak directly to the people and discourage the quiet charges of critics that he was somehow an invalid or not up to the position. By 1932, most Americans had a radio listening to entertainment and news programs by the fire after dinner. By calling his broadcasts, quote, fireside chats, it almost seemed Roosevelt was sitting in your living room talking to you individually. It greatly increased his popularity and that of his policies. By the end of his presidency, FDR had given over 30 nationally broadcast fireside chats. Presidents since Roosevelt have been made, excellent use of radio and, of course, today, television. One of Roosevelt's greatest assets was his wife Eleanor. A part of the larger Roosevelt clan, Eleanor had first met Franklin when they were children, and Roosevelt's mother strongly encouraged the relationship, figuring that the match solidified Franklin Roosevelt's economic status and his political ambitions. The couple eventually had 6 children, but one of them died in infancy. Breaking with tradition, Eleanor sought to seek a more public and activist role for the First Lady. This activism made Eleanor a controversial figure. She made hundreds of appearances on Roosevelt's behalf, traveling for speeches where FDR's paralysis made it possible. One of the places Eleanor traveled to was southeastern Oklahoma State University. Eleanor was a strong advocate of African American women's rights. In FDR's first year as president, she earned $75,000 in speaking fees, which she donated to charity. She began writing a widely syndicated column entitled My Day. When the black opera singer Marian Anderson was denied the right to sing at Constitution Hall, owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution, Eleanor resigned her Daughters of American Revolution membership and helped arrange another concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, which became an early civil rights rally. Like all historical figures, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt were human, and they had their flaws. Franklin loved Eleanor away, but his true romantic love was Eleanor's social secretary, Lucy Mercer, an affair that lasted from 1914 to FDR's death. When Eleanor found love letters to Franklin, the couple's relationship would never be the same, more of a political partnership and mutual respect than the real intimacy of marriage. Franklin wanted to get a divorce and marry Lucy, but Lucy made it clear that she would not marry a divorced man with 5 children. Moreover, Franklin's mother insisted that Franklin divorce Eleanor, that if Franklin divorced Eleanor, it would scandalize the family and she would cut him off from his inheritance. Franklin promised Eleanor he'd never see Lucy again after Eleanor found the letters, but it proved to be a pledge he didn't keep. Lucy Mercer was indeed with him at Warm Spring, Georgia, on the day he died. As for Eleanor, she kept her own individual schedule, even constructing a separate cottage for her at Hyde Park, termed Valkill. Living 20 years after Franklin, Eleanor kept up close correspondence with a number of women, one of which was a journalist known to be a lesbian. Historians have uncovered romantic letters to Eleanor, but today controversy exists over whether Eleanor ever really had a physical relationship outside of her marriage. As a sidebar, Franklin had a dog named Fala, which was often photographed with Roosevelt and became one of the most famous dogs in the world. As a matter of fact, Fala even made one of his statutes. This concludes the section on Franklin Roosevelt, the man, his personal life.